Hi, I'm Ellen Halliday, Deputy Editor of Prospect. You're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of the Prospect podcast with this week's special guest. For the full episode with additional discussion from Prospect Senior Editor Alona Ferber and myself, click the link in the description below to listen via your favourite podcast app. And if you'd like to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, visit prospectmagazine.co.uk.
Nathan Thrall is an American journalist and author of 2 books on Israel-Palestine, the most recent of which, A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, won the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction. In the book, Nathan follows Abed Salama's life before and after the day his son Milad died in a 2012 road accident in the West Bank, on the other side of the dividing wall from Thrall's home in Jerusalem. Nathan, thank you so much for joining us this morning from your hotel room in Germany. We really appreciate it. You usually don't live in a hotel in Germany. Your home, as we said in the introduction, is in Jerusalem. It's been a bleak week in Israel-Palestine. It's been a bleak almost year since the war in Gaza and the 7th of October attack. You've lived in Jerusalem for many years now, although you were born in the States. What's the mood like in the city at the moment?
Well, at the immediate moment, it's a very depressed mood. There was a huge funeral for one of the most prominent hostages, who was an American citizen, moved with his family when he was 7 or 8 years old. And he had lost his arm on October 7th, and his name and his face was much more prominent than other hostages in Israel as well, and particularly in Jerusalem, not just in the United States. His parents spoke at the Democratic National Convention, and there was an enormous turnout for his funeral. And I think that there's really a sense of despair, particularly among kind of centrist and center-left Israeli Jews who believe that the government has abandoned the hostages and has decided that it's more important to keep this governing coalition together and avoid elections than to do a hostage exchange deal. Now, I actually think that it's more complicated than that. I think that there is a real rationale that goes beyond just coalition survival for why the government is behaving the way that it is, but it's certainly a big part of why we haven't had a hostage exchange.
Yeah, I guess it depends on which member of the government you're talking about. They have different rationales.
Absolutely. But in Netanyahu's case, I mean, it is the case that he really wants to avoid the coalition falling apart, and he would face that if he were to do a hostage exchange deal. And that's of paramount importance. But it's also the case that many people on the Israeli right believe that to have a full withdrawal from Gaza and an end to the war, which are the 2 basic conditions that Hamas has asked for all along and really hasn't wavered from, would be a defeat for Israel. And they believe that as soon as that were to happen, Hamas would not only claim a victory, but would quickly restore its control over Gaza. And what would the Israeli government be able to say to the public about how they're going to avoid a future October 7th? And I think that is a real logic, and that there isn't, one can't simply ascribe all of the actions of the Israeli right to a cynical desire to keep the coalition together.
Nathan, I'd love to ask you a bit more about where Israel and where the Israeli government as well goes from here later on. But I want to also ask you a bit about your book, A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, which was written before the current situation that we're seeing. And in that book, you paint a very vivid picture of what it's like to be a Palestinian living in land occupied by Israel, of the way that different laws apply to Israeli Jews and to Palestinians. And you tell the story of the life of a man and his youth through his political awakening as a young man. And then the story is really centered around an accident that happens to his son on his way to school in 2012, or on the way to a school trip. as you narrate it, there are these details of Israel's occupation of the walls and the checkpoints, as well as the past of this place that you now live as well. Could you explain a bit how you came to know this character of Abed Salama, how you came to that story, why he trusted you to tell his story as well?
Yeah. I should say that, before I met Abed and before I even settled on telling the story of this particular accident, I had the notion of telling the story of some kind of an incident that brought Israeli Jews and Palestinians into contact with one another. And I wanted to do a work of narrative nonfiction that would tell the broader story of Israel-Palestine. And because these communities are so segregated, with Palestinian-only communities living adjacent to Jewish-only communities, often the Jewish-only communities are on the land of the neighboring Palestinian village, and virtually no contact between them. And so that really narrowed the possibilities for what kind of a work of narrative nonfiction could tell the story of both Israeli Jews and Palestinians. And it was also important to me not to choose an incident that was extraordinary. I didn't want to have a reader be able to dismiss the content of the book as an exception, that this particular commander made this particular flawed decision and everything that unfolded as a result. I was really interested in offering a critique of an entire system, and I thought that the best way to illustrate that is through the everyday. And this particular accident was, for me, emblematic of a policy of deliberate neglect of a huge number of Palestinians who live on the other side of the wall, just a couple of kilometers from my own home. And once I had settled on telling the story of this particular accident, I went and tried to reach everybody who was connected to it in any way: emergency service personnel, teachers, parents, children, medical professionals. And Abed was one of the first people. He's the father of one of the children on the school bus. And he was one of the first people that I met. And as soon as I heard his story, I was deeply moved by it. And I felt a connection to him. And I also saw that through his very simple and human quest to find his son and to locate his son and find out what happened to his son, in all of the obstacles that he faced just to answer this basic question of where is my son and what happened to him, was actually a very good and clear and simple way of illustrating a much broader system of control, of segregated roads and permits and an entirely walled-off community that the Palestinian Authority does not enter and the Israeli state deliberately neglects. And so very early on, I already had the notion that Abed would probably be the center of this book. And we began to spend a lot of time together. And the more I heard his story, not just the story of that day of the accident and the immediate aftermath of the accident, but his life story, I really felt that here was the entire Palestinian story in one life, the story of a young man who graduates high school and the first Intifada breaks out and he is recruited into a left-wing political faction by a brother-in-law who is sent to jail, and he himself becomes the local leader at a very young age of this left political faction and is arrested and tortured. And I thought also through his life story that I could really show way that the Israeli system of control permeates not just the most obvious aspects of Palestinian life and constricting movement and requiring permits just to go to, the hospital on the other side of the wall, but also the most intimate details of Palestinian life. And I was really taken by one particular event in Abed's life where he was at risk of losing his job in Jerusalem along with his co-workers. And he and his co-workers were trying to find a way that they could get the right permit to keep their jobs. And Abed at one point even chose a marriage partner.
This is when he was working in an Israeli phone company, right?
That's right. That's right. And at one point, Abed and some of his co-workers sought out marriage partners based on the color of the woman's ID. And that was just one of so many examples of how this system of control shapes every aspect of Palestinian life.
The book, and it's an astonishing read, and you really show those details rather than tell what it is that you kind of are seeing. But you've made an argument about this. The book you wrote grew out of an essay that you wrote for the New York Review of Books in 2021, but you've written a lot of pieces, including something that you wrote, I think, the same year for the London Review of Books, where you kind of outline how Israel-Palestine has become a one-state reality. And when you wrote that in 2021, we were kind of at the cusp of the idea that Israel commits crimes of apartheid in the Palestinian occupied territories. We're at the cusp of that being kind of consensus among human rights groups. But today, kind of a few years on, it's still not the view that's shared in diplomatic circles, certainly not publicly. Do you think that we are reaching a sort of a tipping point on this being understood, especially given the ICJ ruling in July on the illegality of the occupation? And the ruling said, specifically said Israel's legislation and measures violate the international prohibition on racial segregation and apartheid. Do you think we're reaching a shift, or is it still a thing that you're going to be making, you're going to be making this case and people are still going to not be willing to see it?
That's a very good question. And I think that the answer is yes to both. I think we are witnessing a shift, and those same diplomats who are not saying apartheid publicly are not denying it privately. And the ICJ ruling, I think, is very important and is really going to put additional pressure on nation states to begin to observe the findings and the recommendations of this ICJ ruling. At the same time, I think this is a very long road, and I will still be making this case for the next few years. It's not going to be, overnight, but you see that it is changing day by day, and I think overall it's happening much more quickly than anybody would have anticipated 5 years ago.
You said in recent interviews, which perhaps kind of connects that idea that there's a better chance today of ending the system of oppression as you outline it against Palestinians than there was on October the 6th. And to some people that might sound like quite a shocking thing to say. Obviously, October the 7th was a transformational moment. But can you explain a bit what you meant in talking about October the 7th as kind of a tipping point, and that since that time there's a greater chance of changing the oppression that you talk about?
Yeah. So, I wrote this book at a time when the international community had become quite bored of Israel-Palestine, was not really focused on Israel-Palestine. It is slipping from the international agenda. Gulf states were normalizing with Israel, stabbing the Palestinians in the back. The Saudis were supposedly going to be next. And everybody was kind of shrugging at the fact that there was a steady takeover and de facto annexation of the West Bank, Israeli Jewish communities expanding, Palestinians being constricted into tighter and tighter enclaves. And this was just accepted either overtly or tacitly by, broadly speaking, liberal opinion in the West. And I, wrote a work of narrative nonfiction specifically because I was trying to penetrate that indifference. And I thought that the way to do that, the best way to do that, was by not a work of argumentation, but by telling a very human story that people could empathize with. And so that was the atmosphere in which I was writing the book. And it's kind of crazy to think about today, when Israel-Palestine is at the top of the international agenda, a bit less already than it was several months ago, it should be said. But what I have felt for many years is that there is a status quo that is very, very robust in Israel-Palestine, a status quo of indefinite Israeli control over millions of Palestinians and depriving them of their basic rights. And that status quo can be altered if Israel were to face a different set of incentives than it has faced for the last several decades. And the only time the international community is really mobilized to try and think about how to change the situation and how to make Israel face a different set of incentives is when there is tremendous violence. And so after October 7th, I knew immediately that there would be renewed calls for Palestinian statehood, that there would be renewed diplomatic efforts to not just end the war in Gaza, but to try and do something more than that. And I think that, the possibility of really making substantive change in Israel-Palestine today, because of that interest, is much greater than it was a year ago.
You talked about the shrugging of the international community, liberals around the world, at the realities of the conflict in Israel-Palestine and the occupation. I wondered whether there's been any sort of Israeli Jewish reaction to your book, and how well do you think the average Israeli, although I think we might know the answer to this question, understands the experience of Palestinians living under occupation and indeed under fire in Gaza, and also whether you think that we've seen obviously over the past week with the recovery of 6 more dead hostages from Gaza, mass protests for a ceasefire, lots of pressure on the government. But do you think that would at some point could it translate into pressure on an Israeli government to sort of end the occupation, or is the mainstream sort of Israeli understanding of what happens to Palestinians in the occupied territories is sort of very limited, or too limited for that?
I'll take that in reverse order. I think that it is very, very unlikely that the protests demanding a hostage deal and the return of the hostages, it's very vaguely stated. They basically are just demanding the return of hostages without getting into any details of what they're willing to pay for that. That is extremely unlikely to translate into demand for end of occupation. This is very much focused on saving Israeli Jewish lives. And as sociologically, a lot of the people who are parts of this protest are the same people who are part of the protests against the Netanyahu government prior to October 7th and were opposing what they saw as a kind of theocratic slide that Israel is in the middle of. And those protests also, although the headline was so-called preserving Israeli democracy, obviously this is a tangent, but there is no definition of democracy that would include a state that holds for the majority of its existence millions of people without basic rights on the basis of their inborn characteristics. And so, those protesters are not, I'm sorry, just to go back a second, those democracy protests, despite democracy being the headline, they really had a tiny, tiny contingent that was focused on occupation. And it was quite ironic to me to see all of these people not just holding up placards about democracy, but also in the evening going and taking Zoom classes about the principles of democracy and the importance of the judiciary and how this works in other countries. and just zero discussion of the fact that there are millions of people who are being deprived of basic civil rights. And so I think that the ability of Israelis to compartmentalize and to ignore the occupation and the conditions of Palestinians and the discrimination against Palestinian citizens as well, all of that has existed for decades, and it will continue to exist. And if anything, today in Israel, there's even greater support for the idea that Israel can never give the Palestinians sovereignty, that it will always have to control their borders. If you'd like to call that a state, you can call it a state. If you want to call it autonomy, you can call it autonomy. But the bottom line is we have to control the Palestinians. And that, I think, since October 7th is an even more widespread view. So I really think that the incentives for Israel to change are going to have to come from other sources, from Palestinians making Israeli control more difficult, and from the outside world that is currently supporting Israel in its steady expansion.
What has the response within Israel been like to your book, if there has been a response?
Yeah. The two countries in which it was very difficult for me to find a publisher were Germany and Israel, not surprisingly. The two most pro-Israel countries in the world. And in both places, there was a fear of publishing this book. Just a few months ago, there was the first Hebrew language review of the book, which was one of the best and most insightful reviews of the book in any language. And actually, as a result of that review, I'm pretty sure that I found a Hebrew language publisher. And so that is now in the works. But that's been the extent of the response. When the Pulitzer Prize was covered in Haaretz, they wrote an article about every single Pulitzer nomination or finalist or winner related to the Middle East in any category, and they didn't mention the book that's on the occupation. It was just excised from their coverage. So again, there is this real ability to live a normal life and ignore what you want to ignore. And if you go to, Jerusalem or Tel Aviv today, the thing that would shock you the most is how normal life feels, that you would not know that there is a war 45 minutes away. So I hope that the book, when it comes out in Hebrew, will find readers and will force Israelis to engage with it. But I also know how good Israelis are at ignoring the occupation.
Just one last question, Nathan. You talked about the need for pressure on the Israeli government, that needs to come from other groups other than the kind of domestic Israeli protest groups. I mean, this week, Britain banned some export licenses to Israel because of possible violations in their use. As you say, that there's been much more discussion internationally in recent months. Diplomats, as we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, are perhaps starting to talk about some of the systems of oppression in the same terms as human rights organizations. Do you think that we are starting to see a shift in that international support for Israel from Israel's traditional allies? Is that pressure starting to really come?
Absolutely. I do believe that it's happening. It's very new. It's startling to see because, again, even though we are seeing the beginning of something important, I still think we are on a very, very long road. And it will take much, much more, orders of magnitude more than what we've seen so far to really change Israeli calculations. But it's clear that things are moving in the direction of holding Israel accountable and toward Israel eventually becoming pariah. When that happens, if that happens, then Israel will have a very different calculus with respect to the basic options it has in front of it with these millions of Palestinians, whether to continue to control them indefinitely and have them live under a system of apartheid, or whether to give them freedom, either in the form of a sovereign state or citizenship.
Nathan, thank you so much for joining us, for talking to us about your book.
Thank you.
I look forward to reading it in Hebrew.
Thank you.
When it comes
pleasure.
out.